Hello and welcome back to another devlog on Picky Plant, a physics game in Unity about causing chaos in a magical marketplace to make sure your hungry plant doesn't die. Right now the game is in an experimentation phase, with the end goal being to create a sandbox of game mechanics and ideas that I can build upon later. I'm in a bit of a bad spot this week, so it's gonna go a little different than how I originally planned it. I messed up when doing dishes and sliced the top of my finger. And I've also got my eyes set on doing a quick project for next week, so it would be fantastic if I could get this healed up in time. Instead of a lot of typing, I can do some catching up on Shadergraph. Plus, the devlogs can get on a path to being a little more visually interesting than checkerboards all over the place. Only one problem though, I don't remember many nodes in Shadergraph, much less writing shaders themselves anymore. It's been quite a while. Starting off with the basics, we've got triplanar shaders. These work by using a mesh's vertex XYZ coordinates as UV coordinates. In the shader, you'll need three primary directions: XY, XZ, and YZ. Then, you'd use that to sample and blend together those three directions with lerp nodes. But it looks like enough people are making that setup that now there's an official triplanar node now, which I didn't figure out until I was done setting up this shader. Oh well. I'm glad it's here. Another small shader I'm going to need is a biplanar node for just the X and Y directions for repeatable textures. I thought biplanar would be a slick name for this, but apparently that's already taken. Later on, I want to build on top of this for texture blending to avoid a tiled look. They look rather ugly and stick out like a sore thumb to me. And speaking of that, I added in those textures from last devlog into the game, and they look kinda gross. I'm gonna have to simplify colors and shapes for this to work. After a little back and forth in Designer and some brighter lighting changes, this is what I'm working with. I still think I'm gonna have to go for a few more back and forth passes, but I think ultimately I need to shoot for less contrast in the textures. Moving back to Shadergraph, I've seen the Dithering effect pop up in games from time to time, and I want to implement that for two different scenarios. The first being that I want the character and certain items not to be totally occluded from being behind a building or debris. This can be done by moving the target game object's graphics into a separate layer, and to split up the rendering with passes from the URP rendering asset. In the first pass, the renderer will skip the targets when drawing everything that's opaque. And then in the next step, it will draw the targets on top with a different material. In this case, it'll be our dither, or sometimes called a stipple shader. The next step will redraw the targets as they normally would look with their default material. Just like that, it's working without writing a single line of code. Now, for the other idea, physics games are pretty resource intensive, so it'll be a good idea to constantly be tackling this issue throughout the project. Best way to do that is to just take out rigid bodies from the simulation. Popping them out is a little jarring, even if I do it off camera, and personally, if I do everything off camera, I feel like the player might get a little confused why things have been changing around. So I feel like I should just own up to it and let the player see it if they encounter it. With that same dither shader, I can fade out objects, and since this behaves as a cutout shader compared to a transparency shader, render, sorting, and shadows will play nicely. I think the best way to remove inactive rigid bodies is to wait a while until a rigid body is asleep. Once a rigid body has been still for a while, Unity puts it to sleep until something interacts with it again, waking it back up. This helps with performance overall, but turns out this is kind of working against me at the moment, since after the fade out, I'm still popping the rigid body out of the simulation, and the rigid body doesn't know about the change, so I'll need an efficient way to wake it back up. Next for Shadergraph Week, it's time for some grass. As far as I know, there's 3 routes for grass. The C# scripting route involves a special method, drawMesh instance, which supplies transforms to the renderer via matrix to use to place all the meshes around. The particle system route involves using mesh particles with infinite lifetimes, and you can use a mesh to place everything on them. Lastly, the purely shader route involves a geometry shader, a special shader that creates geometry on the GPU. But Shadergraph doesn't really support that, and it would also require me to manually create the meshes via code. Out of all of these, I think the particle route might be the fastest to implement, but I'll probably need to replace that with the C# route just for some more performance gains when I need it. That aside, I can still get the final look that I want to get. Even with prototype cylinders, I think this is looking pretty good. On a game mechanics angle, I've got a few things in mind. When I'm level designing, I can hide secret items in them. The player can harvest them as an ingredient for what the plant wants to eat, like bread, or the player can harvest them for feeding animals. I've only got one animal on my mind right now, and that's chickens, and Lucy really wanted to draw some concept art for them as well. So while this week's work has been in progress, she's been working on that with some back and forth for edits. The game mechanic plan for the chickens is to serve as an entity that always stays in the same place, but can change specific items to harder to obtain items, such as wheat in exchange for an egg. Unfortunately, I've started feeling a little ill, so I'm probably gonna have to cut this week a little shorter than I thought, even though I was already planning on shortening this week's work in the first place. So I think after I do my little project, I'm gonna come back to this week to do some more shader stuff. With that, I hope you guys take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.